Today, we're really diving into the deep end, exploring the history and strategic mind of China. It's a huge topic.
It really is. And just to set the scene, think about Henry Kissinger, one of the giants of 20th century diplomacy.
Yeah, of course.
He went to China over 50 times. 50. And those visits, well, they really shaped how he understood Beijing's unique way of dealing with the world.
50 times. And you can see why it would take that kind of immersion. So today, we're going to try and unpack some of that, right? China's view of itself through history, its own approach to international relations.
Exactly. And how these, really deep-seated ideas has shaped how China interacts with the U.S., with everyone, really, from the emperors all the way to now.
And our goal here isn't just to list facts. We want to explore the sort of interplay between China's incredibly long civilization and how it's engaged pragmatically, sometimes contentiously, with Western powers.
Hopefully you'll get some surprising insights into why China acts the way it does. Because different histories, different cultures, well, they lead to different ways of seeing things, don't they?
Definitely. And understanding that feels pretty crucial for navigating the world today. So where do we start?
Let's start right at the core. China's unique self-perception. I mean, think about it. No other country can really claim such a long, unbroken civilization, or such a close tie to its ancient past, its classical strategies.
That continuity is key.
It is. And for centuries, China didn't just see itself as a great civilization among many. It saw itself as civilization itself, fundamentally.
Okay, civilization itself. That's a powerful idea. What does that actually mean for how a nation behaves, especially now when we talk about equal countries? Does that old view still echo?
Oh, absolutely. It's fundamental. This wasn't just, an internal ego trip. The whole East Asian system was kind of built around it. The Chinese emperor, he was seen as the absolute pinnacle of a universal political hierarchy.
Universal, meaning everyone else was sort of slotted in underneath.
Theoretically, yes. Other states were seen as vassals, basically. Chinese language, culture, politics. These weren't just admired. They were the definition of being civilized, which led to this splendid isolation.
Because why engage with others on an equal footing if you don't see them as equal?
Precisely. They simply hadn't encountered societies they considered comparable in culture or scale until much, much later. The idea that the Chinese empire should dominate its region, that was just seen as natural, like gravity, an expression of the mandate of heaven.
Right, the mandate of heaven. Can you unpack that a bit? How's it different from, say, European ideas of divine right?
That's a really crucial difference. The mandate implied China's natural preeminence, sure, but it wasn't like the divine right of kings in Europe, unconditional, passed down by blood. It was conditional. If an emperor was incompetent or corrupt, he could lose the mandate. That actually justified rebellion, a new dynasty taking over. So it wasn't about spreading their values everywhere like American universalism aims to do.
Yeah.
China mostly focused on controlling the barbarians right on its borders, seeking tributaries like Korea. There's a great quote from a Ming emperor in 1372, something like, "Those who come modestly are sent off generously."
Kind of a friendly, if condescending, aloofness, as Kissinger put it.
Exactly that, towards remote barbarians like Europeans. So when Chinese envoys went out, they weren't really diplomats looking to negotiate deals between equals. They were heavenly envoys.
The envoys come to China.
They weren't there to haggle either. They came to be transformed by the emperor's civilizing power, bringing tribute to show they recognized his superior status. You can already see how this sets up major misunderstandings down the line, right?
Yeah, definitely. A collision course waiting to happen when they finally met powers who didn't see it that way.
And this self-perception flowed right into their strategic thinking, which is profoundly different from the West. Think Sun Tzu versus, say, Clausewitz or Jomini.
Okay, Clausewitz's war is politics by other means. Focus on decisive battle, concentrating force.
Right. Western strategy often emphasizes building up superior power, aiming for that knockout blow on the battlefield.
So how does Sun Tzu differ? Can you give an example of that difference in action? Maybe something Western observers just didn't get at the time.
Well, Sun Tzu's is much more about psychology, about positioning, building such a dominant political and psychological advantage that ideally fighting becomes unnecessary. Victory isn't proven by winning battles. It's proven when battles become superfluous.
Shaping the situation so the opponent just gives in.
Exactly. It's about strategic encirclement, about influence, less about direct confrontation. And this philosophical clash really came to a head with Lord Macartney's mission in 1793, the British diplomat.
Ah, yes. He wanted trade. an ambassador.
And the King Court basically said, nope, contrary to all usage. Emperor Qianlong's response was just incredible.
Dismissive doesn't quite cover it, does it?
Not at all. He wrote about King George's respectful humility in sending what he saw as a tribute mission. Macartney ended up having to kneel before a letter from the emperor. It was called one of the most humiliating communications in the annals of British diplomacy.
Ouch. So the message was crystal clear. We're not equals. We're not interested.
Pretty much. And the British reaction, they weren't going to accept that kind of rejection again. The feeling became, well, if China won't open its doors, maybe those doors need to be battered down.
Which sets the stage for
The Opium Wars. China completely misjudged British tech. The emperor told his viceroy to just sort of weary and exhaust the British with talks, not fight them head on.
a fatal miscalculation.
Huge. It led directly to defeat the Treaty of Nanjing, Tianjin, these unequal treaties. They included things like most favored nation clauses, meaning any privilege one Western power got, they all got.
Opening up treaty ports, letting foreigners travel inside China, it was clear China was losing control.
And inside China, this defeat sparked a massive debate. The self-strengthening movement. Should we adopt Western tech, Western ideas?
But the traditional Confucian scholars were worried, right, about losing China's cultural soul.
Deeply ambivalent. It's that classic dilemma. How do you modernize without losing who you are? Then this scholar, Wei Yuan, comes along with some pretty shrewd advice.
What was his take?
Basically, use barbarians against barbarians, and crucially, learn their superior techniques in order to control them. Very pragmatic.
Learn from the enemy to beat the enemy. You can see how that idea would stick around.
Absolutely. That kind of pragmatism, born from a tough spot, echoes right through Chinese foreign policy. Okay, let's jump forward quite a bit. 1949, the People's Republic, Mao Zedong.
The complete revolution, a total break with the past. Or was it?
Well, that's the fascinating thing. Mao talked about this ultimate goal, great harmony, which sounds almost spiritual, utopian. He had this idea that China needed to be, quote, smashed like an atom to unleash its energy.
Sounds pretty radical.
It was, but here's the paradox. While proclaiming this total break, Mao's actual governance relied heavily on traditional Chinese structures.
Like what?
An imperial style of ruling, for one, the idea of the state as an ethical project, and a Mandarin bureaucracy, which Mao kept trying to destroy during things like the Cultural Revolution, but then had to rebuild because, well, you need it to run a country.
And the idea of public service itself was different. You mentioned rectification.
Right. It wasn't just about progress in the Western sense. It was about rectification, bringing order to imbalance, ensuring ideological purity, constant correction within the party and society. It has this moral, almost Confucian dimension, even in a communist system.
And strategically. Did he ditch the old ways? You mentioned he used analogies from traditional games.
He absolutely did. Things like Chinese chess, mahjong, but especially weight.
Go, as we call it, the encirclement game. How does that translate? Could you maybe connect that to something more recent, like their moves in the South China Sea or the Belt and Road Project? Is that a Weiqi mindset?
It's a very tempting comparison. Weiqi is all about gradual positioning, surrounding territory, building influence bit by bit, rather than chess's focus on direct attack and capturing the king. Mao definitely thought in those terms about strategic threats, like encirclement by the US or the Soviets. You saw it clearly in the Korean War.
How so? I thought that was triggered by the North Korean invasion.
It was, but China's decision to intervene was complex. Remember U.S. Secretary of State Atchison's speech? It was a bit vague about whether Korea was inside the U.S. defensive perimeter.
Right, leaving an opening, maybe.
And Stalin. He was hedging his bets. He knew if the U.S. got involved, China would become more dependent on the Soviet Union. So Mao didn't just react to UN forces crossing the 38th parallel. His decision was based on a longer-term assessment of strategic trends.
Thinking ahead, trying to prevent a worse situation down the road.
Exactly. It was preemptive, partly to stop the U.S., sure, but also maybe to counter Soviet influence in Manchuria. It was a classic Weiqi move-blocking potential encirclement, even if the danger wasn't fully formed yet. Huge gambit.
And the relationship with the Soviets didn't stay friendly for long, did it?
No, tensions grew quickly. Mao flatly rejected Khrushchev's ideas about the Soviets using Chinese ports. His line was basically, keep your troops on your own territory. Very blunt.
Sticking to that idea of self-reliance.
Always. And this friction played into the Second Taiwan Strait crisis in 1958. Mao did this bizarre, brilliant thing, shelling the offshore islands, Quemoy and Matsu, but only on odd-numbered days.
Odd-numbered days. What was the point of that?
It was pure psychological warfare. A political battle, he called it. It showed China was serious, unpredictable, willing to push back against perceived threats, in this case, U.S. support for Taiwan, but it also pushed China further into isolation.
And that isolation deepened during the 60s, right? The Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah, the 60s were Mao's decade of continuous revolution. Tumultuous doesn't even begin to describe it. China basically shut itself off. Mao himself later admitted to Edgar Snow that the Cultural Revolution got out of hand, turned into great chaos, fighting with spears, then rifles, then mortars. He even said he regretted the personality cult, just wanted to be called teacher.
But then, amidst all that chaos, came a major foreign policy shift.
A truly pivotal moment, 1969. Border clashes with the Soviet Union got really serious. Mao's military marshals took a huge risk. They told him the Soviets were now the main danger, not the U.S.
Using that old proverb, right? Sit on a mountain and watch the tigers fight, let the U.S. and Soviets wear each other out.
Exactly. And crucially, they recommended opening up to the United States. And this was the key they suggested, dropping the demand that the Taiwan issue had to be solved before any talks could even start.
That must have been music to Nixon's ears. He was looking for a way to shake up the Cold War, ground U.S. policy in national interest.
It was revolutionary for both sides. Think about it. The U.S. president declaring a strategic interest in the survival of a communist country they'd fought a war against just 20 years earlier, a country they barely talked to.
So how did the actual opening happen? It wasn't overnight.
No, it was careful. The initial talks in Warsaw were stuck, a real dialogue of the deaf. But then China signaled it was willing to talk outside those official channels, and crucially, without the Taiwan precondition.
Which led to Kissinger's secret trip.
Yes, the famous secret visit to Beijing. It was all very carefully managed. Nixon's real genius here wasn't just seeing the opportunity, but framing it conceptually. He presented it not as just solving little problems, but as part of an overall strategic design that the Chinese could understand and relate to.
Based on national interest.
Right. And the meeting with Mao, it happened almost immediately after Nixon landed. Very informal, imperial style, the emperor grants an audience when he feels like it.
And Mao's style was unique.
Yeah, totally. Bantering, elliptical, asking questions, making observations. Then he just drops this bombshell on Nixon. Ideology is no longer relevant to U.S.-China relations. Points to Kissinger and says, seize the hour and seize the day. Amazing.
Incredible. And Nixon's approach, he insisted on being totally upfront, saying neither side would do anything unless it was in their own interest.
Yes, complete candor. And paradoxically, the Chinese leaders saw that realism not as cynical, but as a sign of American reliability. They preferred that clear-eyed pragmatism. It matched their own way of thinking.
Even the document they produced, the Shanghai Communique, had some drama behind it.
Oh, yeah. Apparently, Mao read Zhou Enlai's first draft and basically called it bullshit. He insisted it restate all the standard communist positions alongside the areas of agreement.
Why, if they were trying to find common ground?
Because for Mao, peace didn't come from smoothing over differences. It emerged from struggle. You had to acknowledge the conflict, the differences, honestly. China wasn't afraid to state its opposing views, even in a document aimed at bridging gaps.
And on Taiwan, Mao separated it from establishing diplomatic ties later on, but he wasn't optimistic about a peaceful resolution.
He explicitly delinked it in 1973, paving the way for normalization. But he also warned, quite bluntly, I do not believe in a peaceful transition regarding Beijing and Taipei. A clear signal.
So this whole period solidified Mao's idea of a horizontal line strategy.
Yes, basically uniting with anyone willing, the U.S., Europe, Japan, to counter the main threat, which was the Soviet Union. A purely national interest calculation.
But it had its own problems, didn't it? China was still militarily much weaker.
Absolutely. Which meant, ironically, this strategy made China somewhat dependent on American strength, even as they talked constantly about self-reliance.
The whole digging tunnels, surviving on rifles and millet rhetoric.
Exactly. Part bluster to hide weakness, part genuine strategic principle. That deep desire for autonomy always shines through.
Okay, let's move towards the modern era. After Mao, Zhou Enlai makes a key speech.
Right before he died in 1975. His last big public act, he called for the 4 modernizations: agriculture, industry, defense, science, and tech. It was basically a repudiation of the Cultural Revolution's chaos, cleverly presented as being on Chairman Mao's instructions.
Setting the stage for Deng Xiaoping.
Who really launched China into the reform era. Deng took on this incredibly complicated and very long course, as Kissinger described it, of mixing capitalism with socialism, transforming Mao's legacy.
But reforms bring their own problems. Income gaps, corruption.
Yes, the reemergence of luxury. Old guard cadres started complaining about peaceful evolution, China quietly turning capitalist. These tensions simmered.
And then boiled over at Tiananmen Square in 1989.
Triggered by the death of Hu Yaobang, a reformist leader. Students protested initially against corruption and inflation, demanding more freedom. It became huge.
And the U.S. response was tricky. President Bush had to balance public horror back home. People like Nancy Pelosi demanding outrage with the need to maintain the relationship.
Extremely delicate, which is why Bush sent Scowcroft and Eagleburger on that secret mission, flying into Beijing on an unmarked military plane. Shows how vital they felt keeping lines open was, even then.
And Deng's reaction to the protests.
Firm. He famously said it is up to the person who tied the knot to untie it, meaning the U.S. needed to make the first move to repair relations. And he was determined to punish the instigators. Tiananmen really showed the core problem of reforming communism, loosen economic controls, and people inevitably start demanding political freedom, too.
And it was around this time Deng made that famous 24-character statement.
Right, amidst the crisis. Observe calmly, secure our position, cope with affairs calmly, hide our capacities and bide our time, be good at maintaining a low profile, and never claim leadership.
Hide our capacities and bide our time and never claim leadership. Those phrases really echo today, don't they, now that China isn't hiding its capacities anymore?
They absolutely do. It's a maxim that shaped policy for decades. After Tiananmen, Jiang Zemin took over, more of an affable family member style, less imposing than Mao or Deng.
But the tensions remained. Human rights.
Always a point of friction. Chinese leaders would say they could be flexible, but couldn't reach full agreement with the West on these issues. Then the Soviet Union collapsed.
Which must have been a huge shock in Beijing.
Massive. But it also reinforced their chosen path. Zhirongji, the economic czar, famously said, "I'm not China's Gorbachev," the message. Economic reform first, political reform, maybe later, maybe never. Stability above all.
And then another flashpoint. The Belgrade embassy bombing in '99.
During the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, the U.S. accidentally hit the Chinese embassy. Huge outrage in China. Jiang Zemin gave this defiant speech. The Great People's Republic of China will never be bullied, tapping into that historical memory of humiliation.
So bringing us into the 21st century, we get the fourth-generation leaders, Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao.
Right. Notably, they came to power through the party's own constitutional processes, not through revolution or seizing power. Their focus was on a harmonious society at home and a harmonious world abroad.
And the strategy became peaceful development. Is that just rhetoric or something real?
Kissinger argues it's not just a trick, but a genuine policy rooted in Chinese interests and their reading of the global situation. They see stability and economic growth as paramount. But alongside that, there's this ongoing internal debate in China about its destiny, now driven by its strength, not its weakness.
So where does that leave things? Both China and the U.S. talk about partnership.
But defining what that means, figuring out how to manage the inevitable friction, building, as Kissinger says, shelters against the storms that will surely come. Those are the huge unsolved challenges.
We've covered a massive sweep of history here, from ancient self-perception to modern dilemmas. The key takeaway for you listening is probably appreciating just how deep these historical roots go. China's unique view of itself, its distinct strategic culture, Sun Tzu. Weiqi, these things genuinely inform its actions, even through revolutions and reforms.
It's not always about finding perfect agreement or thinking the same way. Maybe it's more about, as Kissinger suggests, managing the ambiguities. Understanding that different histories lead to different conclusions, but that doesn't have to mean constant conflict, especially when global interests are so intertwined. It's not necessarily a zero-sum game.
Right. It's about finding ways to navigate those differences. A final thought to leave you with. What strikes you most about how China has managed to maintain these core ideas about itself and its place in the world across millennia, while also adapting so dramatically to modern challenges? Something to ponder.